So what I'm about to present today is from my 30 years of experience with pesticides and pesticide research. As Maria Elena mentioned, I'm now retired from the federal government, the Department of the Environment in Canada. So certainly everything I say here is strictly my opinion. It does not reflect Canadian policy in the matter of pesticides or agriculture. This is ancient history, but I think we need, especially when talking about birds, we need to go back to the birth of synthetic pesticides during World War II. Even in those days, there already had been conflicts between the use of pesticides and birds, mostly with arsenic, lead, mercury, salts that were used before the synthetics came along. But of course, with the introduction of the organochlorine insecticides, this opened a huge world for pest control in agriculture, in forestry, and in domestic situations. Müller, the father of DDT, in his Nobel acceptance speech, talked about all of the ideal characteristics of an insecticide. Of course, it should be toxic to insects, not very much to mammals, fish, plants, other organisms. He never talked about birds, but so be it. It should act rapidly, have a quick knockdown effect. Ideally, because it was used indoors, should not have a bad odor. It should be cheap, inexpensive to produce. It should kill a broad range of insects. I don't think I agree with him, but that was his view. And it should be chemically stable. In his world, chemical stability and persistence was a good thing. He mostly worked in a textile industry, and you wanted to treat the textile, the blankets, against moths, and that was good. We know, of course, that it wasn't so good, that the stability of the chemicals is what caused so much problems, along with the fact that they were fat-soluble and that they were metabolized by warm-blooded organisms with great difficulty. Of course, in birds, the main effect from DDE, the metabolite, primary metabolite of DDT, was eggshell thinning, and you had accumulation in food chains reaching dangerously high levels in predators and fish-eating species. In comes Rachel Carson, 1962, publication of Silent Spring, drawing attention to the pervasive nature of organochlorine insecticides and also others. She talked also about parathion and the early organophosphorus insecticides. And these problems with persistence, the fact that the products were accumulating in humans, being transferred to babies through mother's milk, meant that there was a gradual shift, actually not so gradual, it was fairly sudden around 67, 68. Most of the agricultural uses of DDT and the other organochlorines were phased out in favor of the more toxic organophosphorus insecticides, malathion, parathion, chlorpyrifos, so on, so forth. The regulators in those days were desperate to find insecticides that had low stability, low environmental persistence. And they totally ignored, in my opinion, having looked at a lot of historical records, totally ignored the extremely, extremely high toxicity of these new materials. I mean, there were a lot of human fatalities, human poisonings, and of course, a lot of wildlife poisonings as well. Later on in my presentation, I will argue that regulators, I think, once again, are making a very similar mistake. And they're falling into the trap of adopting a new technology very rapidly, completely, without looking at the long term. Just because you're already dealing with a problem. Oops. Wrong one. There's 3 buttons. This is very challenging for me. Nope, see, the other one. Yeah, the other one didn't work. Okay, here we go. So, it is hard to imagine just how toxic these chemicals are to birds. You can make simple back-of-the-envelope calculations. For instance, 1 hectare of maize treated with carbofuran, which was a very widespread carbamate insecticide for a long time, represents 41 million lethal doses to a songbird. You're packing a lot of toxicity into those areas. Based on company studies, I estimated that at the peak of its popularity, 1 formulation of carbofuran alone, the granular formulation in maize, girasol, and other crops, was killing between 17 and 91 million songbirds per year just in the corn growing area of the US. So we're talking fairly substantial mortality. If you look at the new products, the new organophosphorus products, not so new anymore, but they were in those days, you can see that the difference in the killing power between a man and a bird with DDT is 430, diazinon over 300,000. So we've really increased the toxicity of products to birds. And a lot of different birds. This is just the families of birds found in the US and Canada to have been killed by the granular formulation of carbofuran. So we're talking birds of prey, birds that eat insects, birds that eat seeds, birds in terrestrial environments, birds in aquatic environments. A lot of birds frequent the edges of our farm fields. So when you apply a very dangerous product in a field, it affects the broad diversity. I'll mention another example, and that's monocrotophos. This is the product that first brought me to Argentina. Mary Elena mentioned the problem we had with the aguiluchos and Takura control. So this was in 1994, 1995. Maybe about 20,000 birds were killed. That is an estimate. However, when we started looking at the historical information and the company information, it should not have been a surprise. The company did a study in 1970 where they treated only 2 hectares of corn and sent some biologists to look at the effects. And this is what they found in terms of dead or paralyzed birds from 2 hectares. So they knew back in 1970 that this was an excellent avicide. In fact, they tried to register the product as an avicide. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise. What is tragic is that monocrotophos is still used in many countries as an insecticide and taking a very, very heavy toll on birds. There was 1 incident shortly thereafter in Florida. 2 fields, 2 small potato fields treated, estimated 10,000 American robins. This is like torsal, a species of torsal. So some of you have been in fields and you're saying, this is not possible. If there was this much mortality all the time, I would have seen it. The fact of it is very, very difficult to see mortality in fields. Now, these are some of the pictures that have come out of the aguilucho experience. This was done by National Geographic, but of course, these birds were all gathered from a very wide area, and they were all put in a nice pile because this looks good for a photograph. Most bird kills are like this. There's a bird, and it actually is one of our most colorful birds. in this picture. This is what a bird kill looks like. But once you have this type of kill over tens of thousands of hectares, you start having impacts on populations. So the most significant impact is not necessarily the most visible one. With time and many studies later, we started to understand what were the conditions that were problematic for birds. I mentioned granulars. Granulars have always been a huge problem. Why? Because birds don't have teeth. They need to ingest small grit, little sand particles, in order to digest their food. Granules often look very much like ideal grit material, and therefore they're actively looked for by birds in fields. Granulars typically are 5, 10, 15% in concentration. That's a huge amount of active ingredient, enough to cause damage. Fields that are flooded bring birds. Fields that are irrigated bring birds. We've had mortality with birds standing underneath irrigation pipes going, ah, and when the chemicals were mixed in with the irrigation water, bad idea. Of course, in Canada especially, we've had a lot of treatment of forests, and in the US and elsewhere for pastures, for locusts, so whenever you treat a natural wildlife habitat, then of course exposure is that much higher. Birds that graze grass. This is a golf course, it could be lawns, it could be parks. Material diazinon is a good example, a lot of mortality as a result of birds grazing on grass after treatment. Birds that scavenge. Now, these compounds, the organophosphorus, the carbamate insecticides, do not bioaccumulate up the food chain. It's not like the organochlorines. However, because of the very high concentration in seeds or in granules or even contaminated insects, the gut contents often are extremely toxic. So if a scavenger happens to ingest the gastrointestinal content of the prey, this is when we see poisoning. Of course, people know that these products are very toxic, and they are used maliciously also to get rid of problem wildlife in many countries. Another high risk and very tragic situation is birds that control pests. The aguilucho was one of those birds, following swarms of grasshoppers and eating large concentration of insects that had been treated with monocrotophos and other insecticides. And there are other examples of this: storks, owls, gulls, falcons, and it is a problem that repeats itself around the world. Seed treatments we need to mention because we are more and more going to a strategy of seed treatments, and I'll be talking more about that later. Of course, seed treatments are advantageous from some points of view. It usually means you apply less pesticide per hectare. They're also safer to the farmer than a spray application, but they have a number of very significant disadvantages to birds and also small mammals to a lesser extent. They're very attractive to a lot of bird species. They have a very high concentration on each seed. So on a hectare basis, it's a low rate. For each particle, it's a very high rate. There is no good way to incorporate them well below the soil. All seeding machinery, whatever the make, whatever the type of seed, always leaves some seed on the surface, either throughout the field or even worse as spills. At the end of the field, when the seeders turn, you see piles of seed on the ground, unincorporated, and those are extremely attractive. The seeds are there for a long time, and they're available, so even if the problem is not acute poisoning, there is a long-term exposure. So you now can be thinking about maybe a reproductive effect because the birds have access to the product for a long period of time while they're breeding. If the seeds are on a soil surface, oftentimes the residues are very persistent, especially if it's dry. The residues will be persistent and they're on the seed for a long time. And even if the seeds are properly incorporated below the soil surface, birds are known to scrape and dig and look for seeds. Now, with the organophosphorus and carbamate insecticide, they affected the acetylcholine systems, and of course we had a lot of mortality, but there were a lot of concerns because these pathways are used for all sorts of physiological behavioral mechanisms. So thermoregulation, endocrine effects, circadian rhythms, sensory, immunology, growth, development, memory can all be affected by the ingestion of those products. And I'll point out that a new category of products that I want to talk about, that I will be talking about later on, affect the same pathways. So, why should we care? Well, the real reason that we care is because birds in farmland are not doing well. This is from central Canada. This is from the UK. A very similar pattern. Intensive agriculture has not been kind to birds. It's not all about pesticides, but pesticides have definitely played an important role. Now, some of you will say, well, we use a lot less pesticides, especially insecticides now, or insecticides and herbicides. We use a lot less now than we used to 20 years ago. This is an old slide, but it continues to drop. This is from Central Province in Canada. And this sort of information is sort of shown to me on a regular basis. See, can't be us, can't be pesticides because we don't use them that much anymore. That's a false perception. In fact, that is the tonnage, the quantity of products used. And the only reason that the amount is dropping over time is that the molecules that we use today are much more effective at low dose. And the dose of product being used is lower. But our dependence and the areas treated have not decreased. In fact, they have continued to increase. This is the data again. This is for the whole of Canada. The only thing not treated is pastures. That's about 30% of the area. So essentially, what we're saying now is that with herbicides, we're treating the entire area. With insecticides and fungicides, it's continuing to increase, mostly in fungicides in recent year. If you count seed treatments now for many crops, even with the insecticide treatment is 100%. In maize, soya, the major crops. There is evidence that that is affecting populations. So we looked at several species of farmland birds and found that their loss of population was directly related to the amount of pesticides that were being used for treatment. This is in canola, colza, oilseed rape, I'm not sure what you call it in this country, colza. Yep. Coming back to Argentina, this is data from Brian Woodbridge, who was also working on the aguilucho issue. He looked at banding or ringing returns here and plotted the apparent survival of birds in the US on this population of aguiluchos. And it shows a very interesting relationship to the pesticide use efforts for tucuras at that time in Argentina. I mean, it's a correlation, not causation, but it's somewhat suggestive, I think, in a lot of minds. I recently did an analysis of all of the farmland bird species. I used the US because I have better pesticide information from the US, using breeding bird surveys, and found that the calculated risk from acute pesticides with acute toxicity, lethal toxicity, was the best variable to explain declines of farmland birds, more than habitat, more than other variables that I was expecting to see as being more important. So, why did we let this happen? Why was it as bad as it was? Why did we register products that are decreasing biodiversity and killing bird species in our farmland? On one level, it's because we don't care very much. I think there's a long history of regulators, and I'm not talking necessarily this country. I think what you did in this country with monocrotophos and the aguiluchos and how fast the problem was solved was exemplary. In a lot of countries, even though they know that whether it's carbofuran, which took 30 years in review to finally remove it in the US, or some of the other products, the bird kills are seen as a necessary evil of farming, unfortunately. And that's why they have been ignored for so many years. Also, though, I recognize that it's not always easy to predict which way it's going to go after a new product is introduced. Are you going to have a happy dorsal, or are you going to have a very dead dorsal? And that I spent a lot of my research career trying to improve the process of deciding which way it was going to go. The risk assessment process in most countries takes a very similar form. You try to estimate how much your organism is being exposed to. You see how toxic the product is. You put those two things together, and you come up with a risk quotient or toxicity exposure ratio. They say in the EU, it's the same thing. And then you calculate risk. Sounds simple. It's made simple, but it's not. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of difficulty associated with the process. Typically, with birds, you have two species only being tested. You've got bobwhite, mallard. Those are the traditional species mandated by the EPA over 30, 40 years ago. And then for the exposure side, you come up with a scenario. You say, okay, I have a small bird of low body weight with a certain metabolic rate. It's going into the field. It's encountering food items that have been treated with the product. Therefore, there's contamination. You estimate a food consumption rate, the time it spends in the area, and you say, is this good or is this bad? But major uncertainties. One that is very poorly accounted for is that there is a huge difference in sensitivity between species to a given pesticide. So we test two, and sometimes only one. The law in the US says only one is needed. This is an example where I took data for 112 different pesticides, insecticides, and just simply calculated a simple ratio of maximum LD50. Does anybody know LD50, lethal dose to half of the population? It's a method of measuring the toxicity of pesticides. The maximum value over the minimum value. What is very depressing here is that the more you test, up to 30, we don't have any points beyond that. This is 30 species of birds tested with this one product. the more the spread, up to over 100-fold difference. So what does testing one species tell you? What does doing all of the calculations based on a bobwhite quail or a mallard tell you? Not very much, unless you consider that this sort of variation is possible. So I won't make this too technical, so I'll go over some concepts fairly quickly. We can go into them at a greater depth if you wish afterwards. But one concept that we have been pushing is basically a mathematical way of dealing with this variation by fitting the data that you have to a distribution, to a frequency distribution, and taking the same part of the distribution for every product, so you can compare products in a fair way. Oftentimes, if a new product comes along, you only have 1 or 2 values. You compare this to an older product where you have 10, 12, 15 values. The new product will always look better. Not always. By chance, the new product will look better simply because you have not tested a broad enough range of species. So you think, oh, this is much better for birds or fish or insects or anything else. But in fact, it's not. So it's very important to realize this and to adopt your strategy to consider the whole distribution. When you look at the distribution, you also gain new knowledge. This was 2 different locust insecticides. I did some work with the Australian Plague Locust Commission in Australia. And they had 2 insecticides that they were using against locusts at the time, fenitrophion and fipronil. Fortunately, we had a number of species tested for both. So the median toxicity makes it look like maybe fenitrophion is more toxic. Remember, these are LD50s, low is bad. Okay, this is the quantity of material needed to kill half of your test population. However, if you look at the sensitive end of the curve over here, you find that there is much more variance in the data for fipronil. Some birds are very sensitive, other birds are not sensitive at all. So that you can predict that some birds will in fact start dying, given equal rates of application, sooner than they do with fenitrophion. We had an example like this in Argentina here. INTA did some work on beta-cephalothrin. I thought it was lambda-cyhalothrin. Yeah, beta-cephalothrin. Normally, pyrethroids are not considered to be toxic to birds at all. 2,000 means this is the highest level that was given to the birds. Usually, if nothing happens at 2,000 milligram, the test stops, and this is how it's referred to, greater than. However, there was some company information that showed that they had actually tested canaries and found a value of 100. This was not official. So this was repeated here in Argentina, and in fact, canaries were found to be quite a bit more sensitive to the pyrethroid. We don't know why. Biochemically, we have no idea. But other birds that were available here as in Argentina as pest species were not. So is this the only species sensitive to pyrethroids? Probably not. But we haven't found the others. If you kept testing and testing and testing, I will bet you that you will have a very similar distribution, and you'll find a lot of birds with intermediate susceptibility to fill the gap between the not sensitive and the more sensitive. So regulators can sort of understand this problem. They don't deal with it very well. They don't account for it very much. But then they get very, very uncomfortable when you point out that maybe they have it all wrong. Maybe birds don't die in fields because they are eating contaminated food. Well, in the case of the aguiluchos and the tucuras, I'm quite sure that was the main source of exposure. In many cases, it's not nearly that clear. In fact, there is a lot of evidence that birds, like workers in fields, can be exposed through their skin, dermally. As early as 1965, we had some information from the forestry environment to show that you just put birds in sprayed foliage and they would die without any elementary exposure, no dietary exposure. FAO in the 70s and 80s were sponsoring research on how to control qualia in Africa by spraying them with fenthion with very high dermal absorption, and they were killing them in a roost from airplanes. No dietary intake whatsoever. There were companies that were perfecting systems to kill birds by putting poisons in a perch. The bird only had to land on a perch and would pick up enough of the pesticide through their feet. And there was some laboratory evidence, and on and on and on. I even long time ago now, did some work to show that you could put birds in a spray chamber, expose them to a mist of phenyltrethion, which was then used in forestry, and have the same effect as we saw in a wild situation without any dietary intake. I like to show this picture to my students, and that really scares the young male students because they can see that I used to have hair, and it's a sort of it's a cautionary tale for them. Well, I don't know what scares them more, that I was in the lab or that I had hair. And then there was I think the definitive work that showed that, in fact, the dermal exposure in birds under controlled conditions is more important than the dietary over the course of the first 2 days after a spray. This was done in 1991. Excellent paper. Have the registration systems changed to take this into account? Not yet. That's a big lag, in my estimate. So, many years ago, I decided that it's really hard to predict sometimes, just based on toxicity, what will happen. We need to look at the field. So I went about collecting a large number of field trials where pesticides had been applied and people had gone in to look for carcasses, and then did some modeling to show that as you increase the toxicity and the application rate, your chances, this is a logistic regression and a change of state from essentially alive to dead. Simply shows the probability of a change of state as you increase the toxicity. And then, as you can see, a lot of overlap, and I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why this bird here died and this one did not. And you can put in other variables, and I can tell you that variables that express the ability of chemicals to penetrate skin are the most important variables that help to explain some of this wide variation. Once you have a model, you can then put that on a GIS level and ask, where do I predict we're going to have the most bird mortality? So again, I did this for the US. It's been done for part of the Pampas with some of the data that were available using those models, and those models were distributed to farmers by INTA so that farmers could make individual decisions on what to apply if they had a choice of products. Now, this is changing. So the situation is evolving, and if I look at the area, so this is a for various row crops, potatoes, tomatoes, that type of thing. If I look at row crops, this is the proportion of the total area where we expect birds to be killed. And it's been dropping. This is the US, again, largely because of what the US the Food Quality Protection Act, which mandated a replacement of a lot of organophosphorus insecticides by other classes of insecticides in order to reduce exposure, not to birds, but to children, because of the increasing amount of evidence that developing neurological systems were being affected. Children have been shown to have learning disabilities as a result of their exposure to organophosphorus insecticides in their food supply. Now, that substitution is almost complete. There are still some organophosphorus insecticides being used. Chlorpyrifos is one that's used quite a bit around the world. I'm not crazy about that product, but anyway. What we have had over the past, since the 90s, past 10, 15 years, has been a replacement with the neonicotinoid insecticides. Now, a lot of you may not be as familiar with these products. A lot of the use has now moved to seed treatments. So it's not nearly as visible as planes going over and spraying the fields. The products are systemic, so they can be used as seed treatments. They come up through the phloem in the plants and then remain toxic to the pests for a long time. In my books, that is not consistent with principles of good integrated pest management, because your insecticide is there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whether you need it or you don't. And I predict it will foster resistance issues much more quickly, and it's having broad effects on ecosystems. I think that the neonicotinoid insecticides, imidacloprid, clothianidin, thiamethoxam, thiacloprid, there's a few others, are the perfect storm. I don't know if you know that expression in Spanish. It's just a lot of very worrisome things are happening. We know that they're very toxic. They're very good insecticides. They're too good. They're too good as insecticides. They're very toxic to a very broad range of insects and invertebrates, actually, at large. You've probably heard of them in the context of bees. We'll talk about bees later. But it's much more than bees. Very broadly toxic. And not all insects are bad. They bind almost irreversibly to insect neurons. And that makes the cumulative action possible. So a small dose is going to have an effect if repeated over several days. They're systemic, as I mentioned. They're there, whether you need them or not. They're extremely persistent in soil. Clothianidin has a half-life exceeding 1 year. And it keeps accumulating in soil for at least 3 years of testing that's been done. And it's systemic, so it's not just a crop, but it's any plant growing near or in the crop as well. Extremely water-soluble, very prone to surface runoff. Known to cause both behavioral effects and immune dysfunction in bees and other insects. In termites, it's touted as an advantage. Bayer was saying, this product is great, this is imidacloprid. It's great because it affects the behavior, the colony behavior of the termites. The termites don't groom, so they die from fungal diseases. They don't communicate with each other, so the colony structure breaks down. But then when people started doing research on bees and say, hey, that's what's happening in bees, they said, no, that's not possible. But it's actually in the publicity that they put out for termites. Of course, the rise in popularity, I don't know specifically about this country, but I suspect it's very similar because you have a corn, soy, wheat type of agriculture as we do, has been very meteoric. It's been very, very fast. As I said, today, at least if I can speak from Canada, US, Europe, 100% of the maize, 100% of the soya is treated in a very increasing proportion of the cereals. So we're talking huge, huge areas that are being treated. Now, on the good side, they're not as toxic to the farmer. But that could be good, that could be bad. When we start seeing resistance problems, which we will, I think we are already actually, the ability to over-apply safely is going to be there. They're safer, but there are starting to be some disquieting reports. In Japan, people being admitted to emergency at hospital because they drank tea. There was enough neonicotinoid released in their tea to cause heart fibrillation. So this is a situation especially with teas, fruit teas, where you have green teas with rose petals, orange peel, coriander, spices. Every commodity is treated with neonicotinoids. You put that in your teacup, add water, poof, they're extremely water soluble. You get a massive dose of the products. So that, I think, will probably be helpful. It's a very twisted world I live in. When people start dropping in farm fields, then it means that we're going to save birds soon because people pay attention to that. So I'm actually quite happy that people are showing up at emergency in Japan. It's very twisted. I'm very twisted. Now, they are less toxic, but I mentioned seed treatments have very high concentrations of the active ingredients. If you do the calculation, you find that this is rates of treatment of seed based on rates of treatment of seed in Canada, in the US. Imidacloprid, for instance, on maize, in theory, you only need 1/10 of a seed to kill a bird, if that bird is at the sensitive end of the distribution. So we probably do have mortality. Not as important as it was with carbofuran, diazinon, monocrotophos, chlorpyrifos, but we will have mortality as well. And there has been. In France, they've detected mortality. I predict that with these compounds, the worst effects will be indirect. By indirect, I mean a removal of the food base that feeds birds, fish, frogs, and other consumers in the ecosystems that we study. A long time ago, the British did some work on the partridge, this bird here, to show that the mortality of the chicks was much higher if the lower the amount of food available. So the chicks were in poor condition, and they were dying from, if not starvation, higher predation rates, et cetera, et cetera. So loss of food in agricultural systems is important to birds. We know that. I mentioned that these products were persistent and mobile. I think most of you are probably familiar with atrazine. Atrazine has been a headache for most regulatory bodies because it's found in groundwater, because it's found in surface water, and it's extremely persistent. Well, guess what? The three main neonicotinoids just blow atrazine away. The GUS index is simply a measure of how easily it will end up in groundwater. The higher the index, the more likely it is to end up in groundwater. Atrazine, 3.3. Imidacloprid, 3.8, 3.7, 4.9. Persistence, atrazine, 75 days. Imidacloprid, 191. Oh, this one looks better, but guess what? 40% of the thiamethoxam gets converted to clothianidin. and it has a 545-day half-life. So these are compounds which, I think if I had been sitting at a desk seeing that as a regulator, I would have said, wait a minute, just what are we putting out there? The toxicity to here crustacea, highly variable, as it is with most products. That is about, that's probably more than usual in terms of numbers, orders of magnitude difference. But look at the difference, and this should be LC50, by the way. This is microgram per liter, so that's a mistake. From 2 to 361,000, okay? All of the original work by regulators were done on Daphne magnia at 35,000. So as far as the EPA is concerned, this is not toxic to aquatic organisms because they did not read the literature. There already was evidence that a lot of these species had already been tested and known to be extremely sensitive. So when it comes time to assess what is the safe level that we should accept in our surface waters, regulators like EPA are just totally off the mark, like totally off the mark. They're in la-la land. So they think that it's okay to have peak exposures of 35 microgram per liter. I mean, even the Europeans said, no, we don't think so. The Dutch, where are the Dutch? The Dutch over here, 0.2. This is an independent publication. EPA came back 2012, 2 years ago. And they said, no, we still think 35 microgram per liter is safe. We looked at the data, probably somewhere between 0.5 and 1 for acute effects. When it comes to chronic effects, so your average exposure over the long term, of course, it's much lower. And there we're closest to the Dutch. Our assessment is probably that it's about 100 times less than the acute level. Now, we already know from the literature that we have levels in surface water that far exceed both the acute and the chronic reference point. We've just started to measure. And this is just imidacloprid. You have clothianidin, thimethoxam, typically not measured. We're just starting to measure those. There is no reason you shouldn't be able to add the three together because they have the same mode of action and probably the same sensitivity to invertebrates. If they look better, it's because we haven't done as much testing with them. Groundwater. The groundwater levels exceed the acute toxicity levels for invertebrates. I think this is the first time in my career that I've seen groundwater that was active at the acute level to aquatic invertebrates. I think that's tragic. But it gets worse. Because these compounds, as I mentioned, have a largely irreversible binding to the insect receptors, the longer you test, so this is the time and days of the test, the less, so it's going in the opposite direction here, the less the LC50 for various species tested. Most of the assessments that we use are based on 48-hour tests with invertebrates. These compounds will be present for 365 days a year in some of the waters. The work from California they were sampling levels throughout the year. Levels did not change throughout the entire year. So what is the real toxicity level that you should be looking for? I don't know, but it's going to be very, very low before you start having major impacts to your aquatic food chain. And if you impact your aquatic food chain, you're impacting insectivorous birds, amphibians, fish, all the consumers. Exposure, long exposure is bad. There's actually a paper that shows that merely looking at your organism for an extended period of time, so you expose your invertebrate for 48 hours, You pull it out, you put it in clean water. 3 weeks later, it still dies from the exposure. So this is actually also very worrisome because typically in aquatic environments, we have pulse exposures. You apply the chemical or you put it in a seed, it rains, you get a pulse in your water. Then the levels drop down, rains again, you get another pulse, smaller usually. What we're seeing here is that that pulse might not kill you now, but it will kill you in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So we've started looking at the possibility that these compounds, and I'm not the first to say it, there have been people around the world who've started drawing attention to bird declines and asking, could these products be responsible? When we have one aerial insectivore, hirundo, not doing so badly, but a little bit of a decline, and then very soon after the introduction of the neonicotinoids, a few years later, wham, we reach a different state. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not. And some work is going on now in our prairies to try to see whether there's a direct link. Now, most of the attention to date has been on bees, pollinators. How many people have heard of the bee issue with neonicotinoids? Put up your hand. Are you serious? Oh, you need to read more. You definitely need to read more. Yeah, oh, here we go. Now that I'm shaming you. Come on, up. Okay, it's a little better, but you tell your neighbor, okay? Because I think there's some reading to be done here. Most of the attention has been on bees. Bees are not doing well. This is the number of honeybee colonies in the US. Over time, it's been declining. We know that bees are important, and of course, people are worried about them because of the economic value, both in pollinating crops, like almonds here, and in honey production. In California, this year, they ran out of bees for pollinating almonds. So it's having an actual impact on their production because they cannot get enough bees in the fields. So conflicts between bees and insecticides are not new, but they've been elevated to a totally new level with this class of compounds. The problem here is that they're systemic, so this has increased the number of exposure routes. So we now know that drinking guttation fluids, this is the water coming up through the phloem of the plant from a seed treatment, the concentration here is enough to have acute effects on the bees' pollinators. So dew, any surface water, we have had kills where bees were drinking from ponds or puddles in fields, possibly drinking even spray solution on plants. Not a good idea. Ingestion of pollen and nectar are contaminated, so weeks, months later, you have levels in pollen and nectar which may not be acutely toxic, but are probably high enough to cause behavioral effects and immune effects. And when the bees are already fighting viruses, varroa, all sorts of diseases and problems, depressing their immune system is probably not the best thing you can do. So we're finding out novel ways of exposure all the time. It was found, because these materials are so acutely toxic to bees, it was found that the dust created by the seeding process, with usually talcum, graphite is added as a lubricant to the seeds, that dust, that cloud moving to beside the field or to another crop was sufficient to kill the bees. So the status today, as I said, they were recently introduced. They're now very important in our agriculture. Imidacloprid is now the most widely used insecticide in the whole world. So it makes Bear happy, doesn't make me so happy anymore. I used to think it was good. When when I was working on carbofuran, I must admit, on the surface, imidacloprid looked good. It looked better. But I think we need to reconsider. So there have been some temporary bans in place, clothianidin, thiamethoxam. In January of last year, the European Food Safety Authority concluded that they presented an unacceptable risk to bees, and they also concluded that the industry studies were flawed, and they put a 2-year moratorium on the product. It cannot be used for 2 years. And there's information coming out all the time on the sublethal immune effects of these products. Now, I'm almost approaching an hour. I think I might skip over the next few slides. I wanted to point out that I've talked mostly about insecticides so far. This is not the only place where we've had some conflicts with wildlife. And one of the issues I've been looking at over the last 10 years is rat control. And the second generation rodenticides such as brodifacoum, difenacoum, bromidalone, flucamufin, which have been a real problem for birds of prey, and we're having a lot of losses of bird of prey. I will skip over these slides, but we can go back to that during question period. Whoop, that's skipping forward if you have questions about that. I just want to finish with, where is this taking me? Where am I going? This is all bad. You can all go afterwards. We'll distribute the razor blades. You can all slit your wrists. After 30 years of working in this area, my conclusion is that there is no perfect solution to pest control. There is no quick fix. There is no silver bullet. It just does not exist. But we keep ignoring that fact. So when we had DDT and the organochlorines, the regulators were saying, we want something short-lived. We want something short-lived. We don't want accumulation. They got the organophosphates. And then they said, woof, everything went to organophosphates. Everybody used them. Every crop got registrations. And then said, oh, they're really toxic. It's killing people, it's killing birds, it's killing fish. That's not good. We need something less toxic, and it's affecting children. We need something less toxic. Neonicotinoids. Well, the pyrethroids, it was a little blip in the road. And then the neonicotinoids come along and say, oh, yeah. And then we adopt the technology. Every crop, every hectare that is seeded out there, massive use. We're doing the same thing again, thinking that this is the only solution to pest control, instead of looking at it intelligently in a long-term context and saying, is that really the best thing we can do? There are problems now in the US where natural enemies and predators are dying from the neonicotinoids because they're eating aphids that have drank the sap from these plants, and the enemies are dying. This is what we were seeing with the organochlorine days. We're going back to those days where we're killing off so many of the natural enemies that we're on a treadmill having to use more and more and more. But the companies are happy because they get to sell more and more and more. So as long as we keep ignoring that we're repeating the same mistake over and over again, I think our environment will continue to suffer. The answer in the end, I don't think, will come from regulators, because they're very quick to accept new technology that the industry puts in front of them and register a lot of products very quickly. I think the answer will probably come from the consumers who start saying, hey, I like birds, I like bees. I'd like to believe that the food that I buy has been grown intelligently and sustainably. And I'm now working with some food producers, companies, to look at ways of assessing the environmental footprint of pest control, because they want to start using this as in their certification systems with their suppliers, and mostly to gain an economic advantage because their consumers are demanding it. So This is something that I will skip over very quickly as well, and I was been talking to Maria Elena, and she mentioned this in her introductory words, that we're looking to see how we could transfer some of this technology here and include that in the calculator that INTA has been doing for birds. So we looked at a lot of different systems, and we found that most of them had some major problems. So we wanted to develop a comprehensive measure of pesticide impact, make it usable at the field level for the grower, because what we want to do is influence what growers are doing and why. And it has to be responsive to changes the growers might be doing, like different application rates or different buffer zones from water bodies and so on. Wherever possible, what we've done is to, like I presented with the birds, is use actual, real data from the fields, impact data from the fields. And we've done that also for aquatic systems. We've gathered about 180 different pond and mesocosm studies where we assemble that and we say, okay, what causes problems and why? And how toxic does the product have to be, and can we predict better? When we don't have field data, we use more of a regulatory approach, but we read the literature. So we stay ahead of the most recent developments. It takes 30 years. I'm now seeing changes in registration procedures in Canada, in the US, that I worked on in the early 80s. It takes that long for regulatory systems to move and adopt new technology, new ways of looking at things. Maximize the use of open information. We're not just looking at the company data, but at all of the data. We measure different environmental sectors, so we're going to have different indicators: birds, mammals, fish, crustacea, algae, bees, earthworms, so you can get a full picture of the impact of an application to your field. And then we're going to work out ways of presenting the information, combining the information to make it easy for growers. So I'll skip on. If you want to know more about this, we can go into this afterwards. Selection of toxicity data points, the sort of strategies I mentioned to fit the toxicity data to get a fair comparison between chemicals. Then we have, and I'm going through very quickly here, this is the type of data that sits behind the calculators that we use. So this is, each one of those points is a pond that has received an insecticide. This is the toxic load into that pond, and this is the number, the proportion of invertebrate taxa that have been affected by that spray. So this is the real world information. We convert that to an equation which we can then put into a spreadsheet environment and basically be able to predict, okay, this is your toxic loading. Well, you have a 60% chance of affecting your aquatic system when you apply that pesticide and allow runoff into water. So we've got different environmental indicators: birds, mammals, earthworms, and so on, as I mentioned. We have wristbands to make it easier for the farmer to say yes, maybe, no. I'll skip over this because I'm past an hour. And then we can combine each of the scores is based on a probability of an impact, a probability of an effect that you don't want. So you can do a field-based solution when you look at all of the products that you've used in the same fields and calculate the joint probability of an impact. And a couple of slides. We use data from California because in California, if you use a pesticide, you have to report to the authorities, tell them what you used, how much, and where to the closest square mile, 1.6 kilometers. We have a huge amount of data, so we can take a small section, say, okay, we're going to take one county, look at all of the cotton growers. Here's 40 growers of cotton in that county. So they all have the same pest pressures. They all have the same conditions. They're growing the same crop. How different are they? And when you do that, you find that the risk picture of each field varies a lot between different growers depending on which products they use. And then you can plot this and say, okay, here's the terrestrial impact, here's their aquatic impact. These farmers are doing pretty darn good because they're keeping both terrestrial and aquatic impacts low. But these farmers need help. He needs some extension help. He needs somebody to tell him, hey, you know what? Your neighbor is only using a fraction of what you're using with a lot less impact. What's wrong with you? And I think this will be a very powerful tool to be able to affect the behavior of growers. And then you can put this on a GIS level and see where your problems are. And I will